As I mentioned during our Time for All Ages, today is a very auspicious day, first day of spring. It will start getting much warmer and the days will start getting longer. I've always been inspired by nature, I think most of my life. More and more now these days, though, I'm starting to believe that nature has lessons for us. More than the warm, fuzzy feelings, nature and her balance have lessons about how to live, how to survive as creatures in this amazing world. This past year, I read the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. In fact, I read it twice. Kimmerer sees the world through her Native American cultural roots and through the lens of being a botanist. She's also a mother and a poet. Her book weaves together all her rich life experience to explore what indigenous wisdom has to offer us today. And yes, you should absolutely read the book. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. Several chapters of her book explore the collaboration that occurs in ecological systems and how humans find their place in that dance. The chapter about pecans captured my attention because I grew up with pecans everywhere. My grandparents even owned this specifically designed pecan picker-upper, so you didn't have to stoop down to pick them up off the ground. And there's a huge pecan tree over my parents' driveway at their house still. When they fall from the sky, it's a pretty loud thunk on a roof of a car. So in this book, I learned that the word pecan comes to English from indigenous languages. The word pecan means nut, any nut. Now, the hickories and the black walnuts and the butternuts of the northern United States all have their own specific indigenous name. But when indigenous peoples were moved from those lands along the Trail of Tears, they left behind those specific trees. Kimmerer shares that her own family was moved from Michigan, eventually to Oklahoma. She imagines, as they were moved south, the appearance of these groves of trees along rivers must have been a really encouraging sight. But without particular names for these trees, they just called them nuts, pecan, which became obviously pecan in English. Now, the shell and the husk of these nuts seem inconvenient from our modern perspective, but they're made, I guess you could say, as they're meant to be. Unlike fruits and berries, which invite us to eat them right away, nuts protect themselves with a hard shell and a leathery green husk. They are designed to be food for the winter, when you need fat and protein. The casing protects the embryo within, but it also virtually guarantees that the nut will get squirreled away someplace safe and eaten later. The even more interesting story is about how these trees bear their fruit. And I never noticed this in our driveway, but nut trees don't make a crop every year. They produce at really unpredictable intervals. Some years a feast, some years a famine. The boom and bust cycle is called massed fruiting. The really peculiar part is that all the trees cooperate on this same totally irregular cycle. Of course, trees don't produce just to feed hungry squirrels and people. They fruit to reproduce. So for mass fruiting to succeed, they have to produce a huge quantity of nuts, so many that the squirrels can't eat them all. The trees can't afford to do that very often, so they don't do it every year. They have to save up for a big special event. No one knows exactly how this all happens. There are still some big mysteries out there. Some scientists believe in this predator satiation hypothesis. It goes something like this. In their fruiting cycle, the trees produce more than the squirrels can eat. and some are left on the ground to make new trees. And when the squirrels get more than their fill of nuts, they have more babies, and the squirrel population skyrockets. In turn, hawks and fox populations also increase. Everyone is fat and happy. But when the next fall comes, things change. The trees stop producing. The squirrels get hungry and take more risk looking, exposing themselves to the hawks and foxes. Through starvation and predation, the squirrel population plummets. Then, as if by magic, the trees begin to conspire, whispering to each other, "Hey, the squirrels are almost gone. This would be a perfect time to make some nuts." And all across the area, pecan flowers emerge, ready to produce a bumper crop at just the right moment. The intricate cycle, the silent conspiracy among the trees, the balance of it all is astounding. It makes me wonder what type of cycle we're a part of. What kinds of shifts will take place to bring balance back to earth? Our call to worship this morning may have been unusual for some of you, the call of the four directions. For the pagans among us, though, it's a very familiar reading. For many indigenous peoples, the sense of four directions of the earth is a pretty important part of their spiritual tradition. There are particular powers associated with each of the directions, whether that's passion or healing or rest. But more important for today, those four directions and four elements are a reminder of a counterbalance of powers. They depict a web of creation that balances itself. And I know it may seem woo-woo, it may seem redundant. And from time to time, I think it's necessary to point out that we really and truly are comprised of the same four elements, the same water, air, fire, and earth that constitute all life. We are water. More than half our body weight is water. And this water is the glue that holds all life together. Any glass of water that we may drink is comprised of molecules that have circulated all over the planet. We're also air. We breathe every minute of our lives. This is probably the most obvious. The most precious element seems to us in pretty great supply. But use your imagination here for a moment. I learned this week that if our planet were reduced to the size of a basketball, the atmosphere, the breathable air in that model, would be about as thin as a single sheet of plastic wrap surrounding that basketball. To keep that air useful, Earth's living organisms circulate it constantly, maintaining and sustaining a balance. Like the water cycle, the air we breathe permeates what we think of as our separate body. Yet the air we breathe goes out into the bodies of those next to us. I know that seems creepy during COVID to even talk about. For a very long time, even scientists thought that it was just empty space. But now we know it's the substance that binds us with the trees and the birds and the worms and the whales. Whatever we do to the air, we do to ourselves. Now, the presence of fire in our lives is a little less obvious. We rarely think of fire within, but in a way, it makes all life possible. And nearly all energy that animates life comes from sunlight and photosynthesis. Even the fossil fuels we dig up out of the ground. We take more than our share of sun's gift of energy. We spent it with abandon, transformed a beautiful gift and imperiled our own future with it. And of course, there's the earth. As great as they are, the sun, water, and air alone don't have enough nutrition of what we consume or what builds our bodies. The nutrients for living things come mostly from the soil. We take in other life forms in our mouths, ingest them, and incorporate their molecules into our own cells. The sacred elements of water, air, sunlight, and soil are basic to us as biological beings. Together, this web, when it is balanced, living beings create for each other the elements that we need to flourish. This only sounds woo-woo to us because several hundred years of Western philosophy and religion have told us that we're above it all. But this connection to a web of life is as real can be. As I first started writing this sermon this week about balance of the earth, in this particular political moment, I was reminded of victory gardens. I had heard of them, but didn't know much about them. I'm sure you all have heard of them. At least your parents and grandparents certainly have. The idea emerged during World War I. Wartime gardening or victory gardens were a way for average Americans and Europeans at home to assist in the war effort. The federal government and all sorts of civic organizations encouraged people to produce their own food, planting gardens in backyards and churchyards and city parks and playgrounds, anywhere they could find some land. I guess Woodrow Wilson even said, "Food will win the war." The results were absolutely amazing. 5.2 million gardens were cultivated in 1918. Producing a huge amount of food. But our involvement in World War I was relatively brief, so that phase of gardening didn't really take off. It was World War II when victory gardens came into full bloom. With food rationing, there was even more motivation to participate. In 1944, it turns out that 30 to 40% of the fresh produce consumed here was grown in victory gardens. Probably most famously, Eleanor Roosevelt planted her own victory garden on the White House lawn. It was a big deal. During both wars, the garden served several purposes. Theoretically, they safeguarded a food supply and eased the burden of feeding troops. But they did a lot more than produce food. They boosted morale by providing a little bit of distraction. With all the scary news and the world falling apart, people could be engaged in something productive and beautiful, something they could invest their time and their effort into. Gardening became a way to express patriotism. This I love. Without wrapping yourself in an American flag, gardening, participating in this joint effort to feed one another, was a demonstration of national pride. As I watch the news and learn about the daily atrocities committed by Putin in Ukraine, I feel pretty powerless. What's happening is so clearly wrong. The scale of the problem is so big and so far away, it feels like there's nothing you can do, and it really is a terrible feeling. Powerless to stop a great moral wrong. So I'm trying to glean what I can from this victory garden idea. Not just the food aspect. Maybe I can grow a couple of vegetables out on the balcony. Who knows? Some of you have tremendous fruit trees and gardens. I think that's awesome. There's more than just the food aspect to embrace from the Victory Gardens, though. One piece is working together as a community to foster our independence. I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but are you also confused by the way people are talking about oil prices? Where is the recognition that reducing fossil fuel consumption is the patriotic thing to do? Little smart cars and Honda Civics and Priuses and electric cars, they're the ones that should have the giant American flags flying out their back window, not the silly giant pickup trucks. Another thing Victory Gardens offered was the commonality that transcended differences. Now, growing things in the dirt is a great equalizer. We don't often think about it, but non-political engagement with our neighbors, just building relationships with other people, is one of the really important things that we can do to bolster democracy. Diverse relationships are critically important for a healthy social ecosystem and a functional democracy. Now, these actions won't stop the ruthless bombing of Ukrainian civilians or push back the Russian forces. Yet what we do and how we live still matters. We have our own fragile democracy to attend to. For the past several years, corporations and financial elites have gobbled up more and more political power, all through legal maneuvers. We have our own oligarchy problem to deal with. And I know it feels powerless watching what happens over there in Ukraine, but what we do and the way we live our lives here still matters. Taking a cue from the earth, it's time to tend to the social ecology of the United States. It's time to reinvest in the life-giving network of complex, diverse relationships. It may be time to live a little more simply, to show that there is, in fact, plenty to go around. I think in the long view, Earth will find her balance. Greedy, over-consuming predators will get their comeuppance. The Earth will find her balance. The smart move for all of us is to make sure we're on the right side of history. Amen.